Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to what I think will be hopefully a reasonably long-running series of videos. We'll see how we go. So the idea is to have a look at the user experience for Foreman, to have a look at the UI, to have a look at the problems with it, and to think about how we can improve things. And this will be no stranger to you if you've been looking at the dev list recently, because we've been looking at this for a little while now, and Roxanne, who you may have seen on one of our earlier videos, has been looking into how we can improve these things. And so we thought it was a good idea, because this is user-facing stuff, we thought this would be a good idea to actually come and ask the community what they thought about possible ways to fix the problems. So we're going to start today with a look at the provisioning wizards that have been proposed. So the idea here is that the provisioning workflow is, let's face it, not exactly ideal. We all know that, I think. And there's some suggestions how we can improve that. So we've got Roxanne with us to go through what she's got in mind, and we've also got a few other people on the Hangout as well. And so the idea is to have a quick look at the problem, have a look at the proposal, and then to maybe have a bit of a discussion and see what people think about the way we might be going with this. So I guess that's enough of an intro. I've talked for quite long enough. Let's get started, shall we? Rox, what do you want to tell us about?
Okay, awesome. I just wanted to go through some of the kind of conceptual stuff we're working with when talking about the provisioning wizard. I had done some previous work on this, but I'm super excited to actually be able to do this for the community so we can gather more feedback and hopefully reach a stronger consensus on what that experience should be. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and let me know.
I'm just going to interrupt you for 1 second. My apologies. I did forget to tell people how to join in, which is kind of important when you're asking the community what they think. So you can, of course, hop into our IRC channel and chat with us there. We're watching that and we'll relay any comments there. And likewise, if you're watching on YouTube, the YouTube chat is monitored as well, and so comments in either of those places are absolutely fine. And then if you're watching this recording much later, then come along to the mailing list, and we'll continue the discussion there afterwards. Okay, sorry, Rox, I totally forgot that.
Not a problem. All right, so I'm going to share my screen, and you guys can let me know if this is not working for whatever reason. But we're good. Good.
Yeah, that looks fine.
So I guess we'll start with the current problem, right? Is that when you go to provision or create a host, that it's not necessarily simple, and I don't think we're ever going to get it to a completely simple state. But there's no guidance, so users very much have to already know.
Rox, can you maximize your browser? We've got background of your desktop.
Is that better?
Zoom in a bit. It's using only about a third of the page.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's much better. And I'll remind viewers that they should up the quality of the broadcast. It defaults to a very low setting for some reason. So if you take that up to like 480p or something, this will be much more understandable.
So over here, you want me to do that?
Not you, sorry. No, it's for viewers to do that.
Okay.
We have no control as a presenter over the defaults that YouTube uses for its video settings. So we have to remind people to do it for them.
Great. So I'll just pick up where I was. A user has to kind of know what they're doing ahead of time in order to successfully go through this process without leaving or not having something previously set up. I've heard directly from users that when they are onboarding new employees, new users, whatever it is they're doing, that it's extremely difficult for them to know what to do, right? Because they haven't memorized the process, they don't know it. So how can we offer more sort of guided setups, or at least how to offer more inline activity occurring so there's less having to, back and forth, having to leave. And so I'm going to switch over to this is, can everybody see this okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so we're looking at some draft wireframes on kind of this whole provisioning workflow and how we can make it a little bit more friendly. This kind of comes from, I had done some original wireframes earlier, but we went through it and I had one really quick initial round of feedback dev design demo meetings that we had and did some changes to this. And so we can talk about this. I'm only going to show you one particular flow, which is for host. I would call it advanced. Ignore the wording. It could be called whatever we want, really. But essentially, they should all work similarly in that when you get to the create a host provisioning page, we're going to give it a more consumer-like feel. So what do you want to do? You want to provision what? And then when they decide on what they want to do, the wizard that's introduced should give them the fields that are needed instead of currently, which is we're going to just show you everything, and fields are going to kind of appear, disappear, depending on which one you picked, and they appear and disappear not in kind of correct order right now, like they're in different tabs, and sometimes things get moved around. So another feature of this page, and this is something customers I think are extremely excited about, is the ability to save their progress. What that means here is that if for whatever reason they have to leave host setup, they're able to save where they were and pick it up later, so they don't have to quit and then lose everything. And in here, this is something for discussion that we can talk about an hour later, is what this is one of the Patternfly cards, what that is. Can we do a % complete, or do we show other information about how to identify this host? And then kebabs for actions. So I guess we'll go to the next screen, which is, so, you know, in this particular example, right, they said, I want the whole thing. This guy's super awesome at whatever he does. Go, I want to see the whole thing. So this is our standard Patternfly wizard. And this one has 1 through 7. Each step is broken down into sub-steps with what I'm thinking of as anchor links. So if they click 1B, the 1B content should just scroll up. And then everything that is required is marked, and everything that they need to fill out is presented right away. Save occurs on next click. This up here actually is also clickable. So if they want to jump around a bit, we can do that. We're not going to prohibit them at all. Interfaces, a little bit of a change just in the way that it's presented. And I think we'll see some kind of more interesting changes on the next one. I know that we had some conversations, at least I have, around IPv4 and IPv6 and how we can sort of handle this within the interface tab. One thing to note is that currently in the setup, if you did not have a prerequisite already determined, you had to leave the entire provisioning setup to go set that up, whatever that is, whether it's operating system, whatever it is. And what I'm thinking about, and what I think would be very helpful, is we allow them to do some of that stuff through the wizard so they don't have to leave. So for example, Create Interface now has modals that appear to input a lot of that information. So here, it's just, I know that this sort of page already exists. I've sort of redone the content in a slightly different order, and then handled the IPv4, IPv6 selections kind of more like a card. So you can choose, and then you can add a card. So here's an added card, and then should you choose to edit or delete, I don't want people to get confused. If you were to click edit, the content in here should then become editable, just like it was in the original creation. And then you could click save. And my reasoning behind that was because from what I understood is that it was possible to potentially, there were use cases where you could potentially add more than one. And this would kind of keep them organized a little better. By the way, anybody feel free to interrupt me at any time if there's any questions or feedback. We don't have to wait till the end. Moving on, I think this will get kind of redundant. We're just kind of showing all of the different steps in this particular advanced flow. Again, had you selected something else, VM or whatever, the steps would be different. The fields presented would be different. It's sort of catering up the content that needs to be filled out. And this is where we'll also see, for example, if you need to add an architecture, currently you would have to leave. Now a modal would appear that would allow you to fill it in, and so it would be present in the wizard without them leaving. In the event they do leave, again, there's a save. Here we're showing installation media, should they want to add that. showing here that 3C, it's anchor linked, it's going to scroll it up so the user can see that these particular fields exist. I think this particular change, there was no confirm password. I'm asking for a confirm password. And I know I'm moving kind of fast now, but that's just because of the nature of what this is. I hope it's understandable.
Yeah, so far it's fine. I've got some questions, but I'm gonna they kind of make sense.
So Puppet, you had Puppet, parameters. Here's all your steps for parameters. I've merely laid this out a little bit to give it a little more breathing room. Got rid of the column headers on this and just went with straight whatever the value should just be here. Again, adding, being able to add this one was already done in line in the tab format, and I think that can be kept for the sake of simplicity. Additional info. So I think this is the more consumerized version, right? You pick what you want to do, and we're going to feed up to you everything that you need to fill out. At the end, there is a review section. This is all dummy text, but essentially in this particular pattern, it's going to show you the steps, and you can go through and see what maybe was particularly selected. We could potentially show errors here if something was not filled out properly or empty when it should have been required. And then being able to, there would be a, load, deploying, whatever, and then a success page, and then being able to view whatever it is that they had just created or close the wizard out completely. That's most of this. You had questions, you said?
Oh, tons of questions. So, and I guess
which page do you want me to do first?
Well, the question is whether it makes, I don't know what the right format to go for, whether we want to jump straight into doing a bit of a panel thing and let everybody kind of have at it. We do have a few comments in the chat so far.
Sure.
Which I'll get to those in a moment. I guess the real thing that stands out to me is the idea of going back to things like this page here that you're showing right now. With a percentage complete. That's something we've never been able to do before, right? Is the idea that you can have a partially completed host. It's an all-in-one thing. You fill in the form, you submit it, it works or it doesn't. You can't come back to something later.
So in these cases that the host has not been created, right?
Right, I get that.
Concept, right?
But we have stored some details about where we've got to, which we can't do today, right? We have no concept of that, right? I'm not saying what you're saying is wrong. I think it's a great idea. I'm just saying this is where we start immediately seeing the sort of new stuff.
Right, yeah,
and it's good. It's really good, but it depends upon the ability to do things in the background, right?
Yes.
And to be able, and that's something we've only literally just started to get working properly, really well in core. I know Catello has the ability to do things in the background to some extent as well, but still, the ability to sort of process host creation and handle things and then store them for the situation that you're in is good to have, and we've needed it for a long time, I think.
Yeah, and this particular item, the users that I have talked to, I go on site, I show them this stuff. They love this idea. Because the process can be so complicated, they love the idea of being able to come back later to something instead of losing everything that they had done.
And just maybe one more clarification. I don't think this would be too related to the asynchronous processing, like the background jobs. It's if you're in the wizard and you just stop on step 3, for example, and just go to other page, this will be stored. But it's not like it would be doing something on background. Using
sure. It's much like what we do with the provisioning wizard right now, right? So stores some objects in the database, but it doesn't necessarily act on them yet.
And one more thing, maybe a bit more background how we get to these wizards. When we talk about the current provisioning form, we realize that one form serves a lot of flows or provisioning flows, basically provisioning use cases. And we realize there are so many combinations that we can't even predict what will be required from user to fill in. So we couldn't even say how far he got in the process. Like, is it the 50%? Is it the 70% already? So what is the first step? As you've seen here, the first selection is whether you want to deploy bare metal, whether you want to deploy a virtual machine, if you want to use image-based provisioning, which gives us at least some idea about what will be required and what will be part of the wizard. So far, we've seen only first wizard. I can imagine image-based provisioning wouldn't have, let's say, 7 steps, but 5, for example.
Right. Exactly.
Right, exactly.
So that would be different. One difference.
Actually,
Also,
sorry, go on.
at the same time, I would like to say, or at least that's what I try to try to explain on last demo or last discussion with Roxanne, is that I don't think we can start just by rewriting the whole host form. I think the last step after the review, maybe it would make sense to actually go into existing host form, but it would be pre-filled based on what user entered in that wizard. So the wizard makes it very easy for you, if you're a new user, to set up the stuff that's required for a specific provisioning flow. Like, for example, for bare metals, it will force you to actually select the operating system, select the subnet. But at the end, you would get into the existing host form, which already contains a lot of logic, which I'm not sure if we should start writing from scratch.
Yeah.
This ideally should be just a helper in the beginning. And also, I hope that was the plan, that people can either use the wizard or just jump right away to the existing form if they already
You
have
actually lead really well into a point made in the YouTube comments from Roman, which is that one of the major issues we have with that form today is with organizations and locations, right? Is that so many of the fields are either disabled or indeed reset when you pick a taxonomy, and the ability to kind of set that up front, that's possibly even like step 0 if you're using that feature. And then because you can't select a compute resource, for example, until you know whether it's in your organization, right? So we can make a lot of the logic, I think, easier in some ways with this as well. Where there's complex logic in that form, it's because everything has to happen at once, right? So that's that's a point. What else have we got here? Just having a look through the comments. So as Brian asks, what would the user should start with? The choice, whether that should be the type of machine or whether you should start from a host group or something like that.
I mean, I think we have. If step 1 really is, I want to create, right? From a UX perspective anyway, there is the ability to add it. These options are whatever we deem are use cases worth putting here, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is a comment, and
that then therefore impacts the steps that are available here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, class actually in IRC is making it's kind of, I guess it's similar. I don't know. My brain's not working very well today. But I mean, sorry, class, I'm going to talk to you directly for a second. I think what you're saying is basically already what we have in host groups. You're talking about templates, right? So for everybody else, he's talking about templates. So for example, you have a default rel 7 VM and you can't change anything in the OS tab because it's fixed. Now, that's kind of just a host group with uneditable fields, right? Locked fields. And that doesn't sound too much like a bad idea. There seems to be quite a bit of discussion about host groups going on, and I think largely I agree. The idea is that if you pick a host group, obviously you want to fill out all the various parts of the wizard that match the host group, right? Presumably we'd have the ability to handle that, so that's fine. To your point, Marek, I agree. You can't just jump straight in and replace the new host form right away. I like the idea that we have many different workflows. As you said, the form is massively overloaded. I would really like it if plugins, certainly compute resource plugins, can define their own kind of provisioning workflows. That would be amazing. Don't know how hard that would be.
I think if we start to implement that, we should think about also extending the workflows that are provided by core, but think about plugins like Foreman Usability or Salt or Chef. They need to add stuff or steps into these flows. So that needs to be priority from the first day.
Yeah, to be fair. I'm thinking about it from the point of view of where you've got, so today, for example, I remember when you and I were doing the networking rework in 1.8, we lost a lot of the flexibility around compute resources, right, and their ability to declare what sort of networking they had. So if you've got a very cloud-based thing like AWS or DigitalOcean or what have you, then actually the new networking modals don't work brilliantly well for that. And the ability, so that was in my head, and I was like, well, can we make it easier to provision a much simpler workflow for something like AWS, right?
Yeah, but maybe, these wizards should, maybe the one of the biggest goal is to make it simple for the new users and for the first kind of provisioning. So we could actually help user to set everything up through that wizard. And after you finish the first provisioning, maybe there could be a button or something like store this as a provisioning template. Maybe it means something like store it as a host group, create a host group based on what I just provided. Or maybe we could think more about whether a host group is the right entity for this. Maybe it's time to start differentiate between the, let's say, provisioning template and the configuration templates and split that or break it down to smaller pieces.
I think that's Klaas's point, because a host group, for example, you can't store nicks, right? You can put those on the compute profile and then mix the two together, but which is what I do. So between a host group and a compute profile, you can have pretty much your entire host set up. But yeah, maybe templates go with this. And Brian also makes a great point that actually talking about whether plugins can extend this, discovery and discovered hosts are obviously a natural entry on this as well. I want to provision a discovered host. So yeah, sorry, that's a slightly different direction, but just wanted to mention that before I lost it in all of the chat that's going on. So
in I had in some draft version, beta, whatever I had, it did have another section on the main page that would be templates, so that you could build from an existing template. I could put that back in here, but it sounds like it needs to be thought out more along with what you guys were talking about.
It does. I like it, and it seems like from what comments we're getting elsewhere, it seems like other people like it as well. But yeah, the interaction between that and host groups would need to be thought through.
Right.
Because of the way host groups are used today. Host groups don't enforce anything, right? They're just a set of defaults, and so if you do something else for provisioning, they essentially become redundant, or at least just a store for things like Puppet classes and stuff. So yeah, that whole interaction between provisioning, host groups, and indeed config groups would have to be kind of thought through a little bit. But overall, I think it's great. I think it's a really nice idea to do that, and I do like the idea of not just the saving the templates, but actually kind of getting partway through provisioning and not having to lose where you've got to. And
that's a key frustration of a lot of the users that I talk to, is that drives them crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you say, it's an advanced thing, right? When you know what you're doing, you can avoid it.
Right. But when you don't, or when you have even users who don't do this that often, right? They might.
Right.
They're just not there that often.
So I really like Marek's point about trying this out and then dropping it into the edit form at the end, just with everything filled out. Because I think that's a nice, safe way of doing things, right? And then we can take it from there. That sounds like a really, really good way forward. Let's just open this up a bit though. We've got what, 1, 2, 3, 4 other people on the Hangout who haven't said a word yet. Guys, do you have any comments you'd like to make? I'll take that as a no. Oh no, Ivan, go on.
No.
Yeah, no fun at all. Or
just say it's perfect. No changes. This
go. So I'm just having a look.
Did we want to comment on this whole IPv4, IPv6?
I'm going to come to that in a sec. I'm just seeing what else we've got, because there's 2 IRC channels and YouTube to track. So, but I can see you're already talking with David in the dev channel. But that should probably be relayed to everybody else for the benefit of the video. So, separate buttons. He asks about separate buttons rather than a drop down, right, for creating hosts.
And I'm not. The issue to me with separate buttons is it's not terribly scalable. So if anything changes, you decide there's 10 of these. Now there's 10 buttons. Again. These options here are what I've sort of put in based on some of the demos that we've done, but they're by no means apps, set in stone or anything. These could be whatever we wanted. If we knew for certain, hey, we're only ever going to have 3 or 4, sure, let's do buttons. But since I wasn't sure that was the case, I just felt like the drop down was a little more conservative when it came to space.
It's true. I think his main point is just that there are things in there that probably shouldn't be, and I agree. But I get the point that this is just representative, right? We can have whatever we like in there.
Right.
Yeah, because for example, the difference between virtual machine and image based, they're basically the same thing. For example, but yeah.
Yeah, I was working off my my notes, which aren't always.
Yeah, it's fine. What else? So just page through the screens again quickly. And I'll see if anything else jumps out at me, and then we'll get to the IPv6 thing. Because I think it's worth everybody else getting a bit of a insight on the discussion we had.
I have a question. One of the reasons that people tend to start working on this and leave the form is that they, for example, they start creating a host and then they realize, oh wait, I don't have the domain I need for this host. So now they have to go to the domains page. Maybe if there's some way to inside the form have like create a new domain or something like that, at least for some of the options. I wonder if that would maybe simplify that a bit.
Yeah, I believe that that is something like you can see now there is an add architecture or add installation media, which should open the model window. And I suppose that should be the same, but I suppose on the interfaces step.
Yep. Yeah, this is definitely a difference between the old way of doing it and the new one, is that people don't, if they did forget something, that they can just do it right here and not leave. I think there's so many dependent components making them leave if they did forget something.
Yeah, I guess I missed this slide. Didn't notice it. But yeah.
It's no problem. I talk really fast, so I'm sure. Let's see, for example, here's add installation media, or we get over here and there's move down to one that has another one here. Well, let's add parameters inline, add hardware model. So again, click it, you can add the hardware model.
Yeah, that's awesome. Another question. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're first.
Okay, so another question I think would be, since obviously it's not like tomorrow we'll have this whole new form ready, what would be the best way going forward? Should it be inside out or outside in? So to explain, should we first convert the existing form just to steps instead of tabs, or first convert the inside to have all of these new things or new layout, and then go to make it into a wizard?
That's probably more of a technical question. If it was me from a user experience strategy standpoint, if we can't do the whole thing right now, which I understand, I would convert it. I'd convert what you have to a wizard, right? And that would put certain things in certain order. And then to me, step 2 would be able to add the modal windows for adding things on the fly, and then building in this, which is the more served up content, right?
Honestly, I think we shouldn't even touch the existing form as long as possible, because it already contains a lot of logic, and also now it's so related. Whenever you change a host group or operating system field, it changes a lot of stuff on other tabs. So converting existing host form into the wizard would be very complicated, I would say. At the same time, I think we can just implement these new wizards, ideally using the new technologies we have, using React and Redux, and have it, let's say, data-driven, what we display to user, rather than having some hooks like we have in existing forms. So I think this could be completely isolated thing. We could just add these wizards, and at the end, take the result of what user provided and just fill this into our existing host form, which works. So the wizard would only make it easier for a user to do the kind of setup of all the stuff that is required.
And to be clear, I don't necessarily, because this is something I think requires more thought, I don't necessarily think the wizard should replace the edit, right? It shouldn't necessarily replace that entire form, meaning if something's already created and they click edit, we might just want to bring them to the existing one. Because most things should be set up.
Sorry, Rox. I mean, you make a good point, and actually it's relevant because this has been talked about on RC for a few minutes. Brian's making the point that do we even need the edit page? Now, it's a controversial statement. Sorry, I just dropped something. Controversial statement there to get rid of that entirely. And his point is that how often, what do people edit when they edit things? And certainly from my experience, it's usually just the Puppet classes and the host group, things like that. Whereas people rarely go back to, say, the OS tab and change the OS of a host. Now, there's an edge case where you want to rebuild a physical host with a new OS, but largely it's virtual machines, you're going to destroy them and build a new one. And if all you're doing is changing the Puppet classes or the host group, then this is a mutation, right? You can do that some other way. You don't necessarily need the edit page. So whilst it's a strong statement, we could, in the long run, we could get rid of the edit form entirely. It is possible. It would be a further discussion. I like Marek's suggestion of starting with dropping the results of the wizard into the form. I think that's step 0. I think step 1, once you've got past step 0, is trusting that the wizard works properly and sending it straight to the API, right? So they're doing the same thing. It's the same submission, but the user doesn't need to see the form. And then once you're happy with that and the form's getting less and less use, then you can look at what to do with it in the future. So I'm just going to have another look around. Let's have a look. More +1s for building things in parallel from Eric, from Brian. My general comment from Roman about the first page, just saying that, if there's only one option, can we just make sure that's selected by default, so the user doesn't have to deal with it. It's a fair comment. It's a small thing, but fair comment. And then let's talk briefly about the, unless anyone wants to jump in on the wider point, I want to focus in a little bit on the IPv4, IPv6 stuff. So does anybody want to throw any more points in before I get to that?
Yeah, just one thing maybe. So Rox, you mentioned the wizard would have, you would be able to basically skip the steps or navigate freely between them. But for example, in this wizard, looking at that, for example, changing the operating system might have impact on the parameters tab.
Right.
So I wonder if, I would like to avoid what we have in current form, that we have set of callbacks and changes happening there. So I'm not sure if this is really a good idea, whether it wouldn't be better actually for a user to be forced to go through each step rather than allowing them to jump back and forth.
Yeah, so it's funny because in theory, I agree with you, but when I talk to users, nobody wants to be caged in ever, right? They want everything served up in correct order, but they want to be able to do whatever they want. So I think that's just kind of a executive decision on development's part. Like, is there a good technical reason we wouldn't want them to do that? Whatever it is. I sort of see both sides, so I can't say I have a strong investment.
Okay, I think maybe the technology will help in here. If we have like a data in Redux, it might be much easier than what we did with jQuery. So maybe that's not an issue anymore.
Yeah. There's one thing though, that you can get into a situation that you set up something that then would get influenced by your previous choices, and you might like not realize it even. So I don't know like how to address that other than like being clear that this gets influenced by something else.
Yeah, I guess if we know those relationships, we can flag it, right? But yeah, I don't think there's so many of those. Hopefully you'd organize things logically, right? So certainly nothing behind you in the steps should be affected by something you're doing right now, right?
I have one example with the provisioning VMs and selecting templates, that you can first like select the parameters for the VM, like the memory and stuff, and then when you're selecting an operating system to provision like the image-based provisioning, and it selects the template for you, it actually overrides the values that you already selected. So this is one of the examples where like having or being clear about what needs to be selected first makes or helps that, because you can, like, if you select first the template and then you would choose that you want to really update the, let's say, the memory size, then like with this order it should work, but otherwise it would be pretty hard to detect if the choice you did before should be overridden or not.
Yeah, tricky. I think it's going to be something we're just going to have to play with, right? And deal with as we come across it. And if we end up in a situation where we can't allow people to jump around, then that's what will have to happen.
Just this is like a personal anecdote or thought, is I don't know if they want that freedom because of the fact that currently things are not necessarily in an order that makes sense to them. So they're concerned about, well, right, their frame of mind comes from the old way of doing it. And so to them, oh, well, I need to be able to do that. not understanding that should we implement this correctly, you won't need to be able to do that, right? Does that make sense what I'm saying? It could be their perspective is a little bit.
Yeah. What's wrong with the way we've always done it is usually the problem, right?
Well, it's based off of their experience, right? So they're used to having to jump around because things aren't in the right order. So there's a issue of, well, is it in the right order? Hopefully they won't need to do that at all.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, it's definitely a case of suck it and see, I think, and see what happens. So
what about tabs that appear or disappear because of different actions? Like after choosing the compute resource, we have the virtual machine tabs. Where would that fit in if we force the order?
Oh, the idea, I think, is that we should avoid like changing the steps of the wizard based on what we select. That's why we have the selector on the first screen, where you first choose whether your flow is deploying a virtual machine or a bare metal, or if you want to do the image-based provisioning. The list here might not be perfect, but there are like 8 flows we've identified. I'm happy to share it later if you want.
Right.
So here you basically choose what wizard you're going to use. And once you're in that wizard, I suppose you shouldn't just change it to a different one because they can differ really a lot.
So there's nothing in the wizard that would make things appear and disappear.
That's the idea. Because we're able to identify what you want to do ahead of time, we don't need to have tabs disappearing, not disappearing, things like that.
Yeah, that sounds easier than today.
Yeah, it's only because the form is overloaded that we have to do that, right? That's the problem. So if we can split out why we're overloading it, then that's better.
And that brings to mind also Mark's point earlier about Chef or Ansible. So you could maybe on the first page just select this is a Puppet host or an Ansible host, or like have like a checkbox maybe or something like that.
Yeah, that's the sort of thing that's mutable because you can technically have both, right?
Yeah.
Although you could always add them later. Like, for example, most of my hosts are currently running both Puppet and Salt because I'm in the middle of a migration. So, yeah.
I think what would be confusing or something to consider, doesn't mean that there's a great solution, is that they start a flow, right? And decided, we have Ansible, right? That's what it is. And they go through this whole thing and discover, oh, no, wait, I have both. And maybe the solution is that they just have to build a new one. I don't know that. That's just a type of user interaction that we probably have to think about how we want to handle that or not handle it.
Yeah, maybe one thing for the first version, maybe we don't even have to have the Puppet and Ansible here in wizards. As long as the wizard is just an, let's say, input to the existing host form. All the plugins are right now extending the host form. So we can just provide information about the provisioning, then jump into existing host form where people can select Puppet classes, Ansible roles, or whatever. And later we will figure out whether we want to add it somewhere in these wizards, whether people want to have it as a part of these wizards, or maybe we come up with the new entities like we discussed a moment ago about the provisioning templates, configuration kind of templates, these kind of things. Maybe there's a new entity that would actually allow you to set
like a new step that says whatever, and we could have a button here that says add Ansible, add whatever.
Could be, yeah.
Certainly for a first pass, while we're still dropping it into the form, that seems like a perfectly reasonable approach, is to deal with the configuration management after you've sorted out all your provisioning, because it's the provisioning where the complexity occurs, let's face it. Selecting a bunch of classes off the Puppet classes page is not that hard. So yeah, that seems like a good first pass. Minor comment from Eva asks if the graphics for the steps at the top of the page will change based on state. So the idea being that if you've got all the way up to, let's say, step 4, which is Puppet, and you go back to step 2 because you've forgotten interface, will step 3 and 4 still show that there's data on them, or will they go back to being white just because that's a static image?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand.
Okay, skip ahead a few pages. It's probably easier if I show you what he means. Okay, so yeah, so his point is that here we are on page 3, and we have no indicator at the top that there's any information been entered in pages 1 and 2, right? And I think he wanted to know whether or not,
for that they're completed.
if you're jumping around and you now don't know which steps you've filled in, right? So
let me take a look at the pattern. I thought that was actually in.
Yeah,
sorry.
It's I think it's not so much a discussion point as just a thing to point out that he wanted to point out.
No, totally reasonable.
Cool. Okay. Let's talk IPv6 for a minute, because I think that's important. So for a little bit of context,
this was my stab in the dark, by the way, after our conversation.
Yeah, and I quite like where it's going. We'll see what Timo's got to say. I know he's watching with a bit of a delay, so he might have comments on the mailing list afterwards. So about a week ago, I think it was, or just under a week ago, we, Roxanne, myself, and Timo from community got together to talk a bit about the problems with interfaces, and in particular IPv6 in the current form. Do you still have your browser open, Rox? Can you show what the current form looks like, just for the people's context?
Yeah, I believe I have it.
So this is what it looks like today, right? And that's just without an IPv6 in there. That I'm guessing is a satellite one with.
Oh, sorry. Let me,
It's fine. It's fine. But even just showing it like that is bad enough, right? And then when you go and look at this form,
here we go.
It's a mess, right? It's a mess. So we got together to have a bit of a chat about what we could do to make this better as part of the larger provisioning workflow. And the major problem we had with that was simply that IPv6 and IPv4 are fundamentally different beasts, right? In the sense that IPv4 is usually a single address, and you can kind of one-to-one map it to a subnet. And IPv6 is definitely not the case. You'll have many addresses attached to a single interface, and oh my God, that's going to be a horrible mess. And so we had a bit of a chat about how we're going to handle that, and Timo and I spoke a bit about the internals of how that might work after you'd gone, which isn't so relevant here. But what I wanted to just say was, let's have a look at what you've come up with based on that chat we had last week. So that's what it looks like today. It's a mess. Let's have a look at this. Let's just walk through this a little bit more. So the idea I think we talked about was that there's a few things that are pretty much always guaranteed. So DNS name is the main one, and the type. MAC address and device identifier are less guaranteed to be useful.
I think. So I'll just start by saying, from our conversation, it was asked that these get moved to the top. That's done.
Right. Yeah.
And under type, MAC address and device identifier are actually advanced options. I got to redo this layout. I don't think it's quite clear. But it's if you click hide, these would be hidden.
Right. Okay. Sure. And so that was part of it. So the bit that we identified is that right now we usually know whether or not a MAC address is required, but it's not always the case. There are some edge cases where you can't tell in advance that you need a MAC address. I seem to remember that the code has to go through about 4 or 5 different checks to determine whether or not a MAC address is actually required. And so some of those you know up front, some of them you don't. But we know, for example, if it's a physical host, we know it's going to be needed. If it's a libvirt host, we know it's definitely not going to be needed, because libvirt always provides a MAC address and things like this, right? So we can try and hide that. Likewise, device identifier isn't that useful most of the time. DNS name is usually required. Domain is usually required. Well, actually, no, that's not true. You can just have a short name and no domain, technically. But where it gets really fun is the subnet. And so let's have a quick look at that. So I'm kind of just working through this with fresh eyes myself. It's the first time I've seen this.
Yeah, sorry. We literally had this conversation earlier.
Yeah, sure. So IPv4, it makes sense, right? You have a single address. It goes to a subnet. Great. Well, how does this look for IPv6 with the multiple addresses? Does that work? Have you got much in mind for that?
We can. I think we can do something about it. My understanding was that they were separate. If they're different cards, or if they're on the same one, let me take a look at it.
So the idea, I think, that we had was that all of the so that this is. Oh, I see what you're doing. Right. Okay. So you can have.
Yeah. So
yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah. No. So you can have multiple cards. So you have one IPv4 card and many IPv6 cards. Got you. Okay, that makes sense. Because what was confusing me is the other thing that's worth remembering is that IPv6 addresses are much longer than IPv4. So while with the card you've got right there on the right, theoretically, not that I'm saying you'd ever do this, but theoretically, there's more than enough space in that card to have 2 or 3 IP addresses in that text field, right?
Right, and we've been using when truncation's occurring. I mean, we've been using the hover over and showing.
Right, but you just couldn't make that work with IPv6. The addresses are huge. You'd have to have 1 per line, and then the card gets really vertically long, right? So
Okay.
if
I'm
it's
taking-
if it's one card per IPv6 address, I think that makes sense. How does that work once you have? Do you just have multiple rows of cards?
Yeah, and I'm
extending the
assuming a
page?
scroll would just occur in the modal.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's cool. I think that makes a lot of sense. I quite
I
like
think
how that
it's
looks.
the same
Maren, what do you
information.
think?
It's just presented different visually to show each independent item, because when I first looked at it, and it just looked like a whole bunch of fields together, and I couldn't quite tell what belonged. For me, anyway, it just didn't visually have the separation I thought it could use.
Yeah, indeed. I quite like that. Maren, what do you think?
Yeah, I wonder. I probably need more time to think about that. But when I'm looking at this, since the IPv4 and IPv6 are so different, I'm not sure if it makes sense here to have more than one IPv4 card, and how we'll let user know basically that they shouldn't add more, even though it makes sense that you can have more IPv4 addresses, like Barry just said on the channel. Right now we implement it through a different interface type, like alias. Maybe it's time to actually change that, but
So just the discussion Timo and I had after the sort of UI part of it last week was to talk about the internals, and I guess I'll get onto that very briefly just for context. Our feeling is that the IP address has to become an entity in its own right? So a host has many interfaces, but an interface has many IP addresses, and it's a pain because when you call something like host.subnet, where does that come from? Are you going to select a primary subnet for each interface? That's just horrendous. So yeah, and then Avid made the point on IOC earlier that we're kind of making the assumption that IPs and subnets map one-to-one, and that's not always true, although it's mostly true, I think. Certainly, if you have an IP object, can it have two subnets? I mean, obviously a subnet can have many IP addresses, that's obvious, but does it go the other way? Does it work the other way? Can an IP have multiple subnets?
No.
I would have said no. I would have said no. So it feels to me like that's at least a one-to-one mapping on the IP address. But then, as you say, you've got the subnet. So this is why the cards are designed the way they are, right? The subnet's selected to go with the IP address, but you've still got to figure out how to decide what host.subnet means, right? So, so we've got some interesting challenges there. But I like the direction of this. I think it helps with the confusion we have around IP addresses at the moment. I'm gonna have a look to see what other people are saying. Yeah, some comments on IC about the layout of the cards, possibly talking about whether it should be rows, etc. I kind of agree. I was thinking a table in my head because there's really not a lot of information. It's like a 2-column table, right? Subnet value. But I don't know what works best there. That seems to be all the comments at the moment. Anybody else got anything they want to add or talk about?
So on the cards, did we may have covered this, but I think instead of having cards, it should just be a list, like rows instead of cards.
Prefer a table.
Yeah. And on the point about using addresses versus alias, I think the alias thing is kind of going away in Linux. I know IP doesn't support it doesn't show them correctly. But if config does, it's weird.
No, you're right. It is going away.
So,
I mean, if config is technically deprecated, I think, and if you add them using IP and then list them with fconfig, you'll get them as aliases, but IP doesn't show them that way. So yeah, it's something we need to fix even for IPv4, right?
Right. Okay.
But that's something we have to deal with on the code side because it's how we represent them today, and it's kind of needs fixing. My wider question, and I'd be interested in answers to this from the community, is how many people actually consume the networking information in the ENC? Because for me, that's where a lot of the sort of we put a lot in that is useful there. Like the device identifier, for example, is not used anywhere in Foreman, as far as I remember. It is literally just there for people to store inventory data in, basically, and use it for things like knowing which devices to bond and things like that. But we make it mandatory and then you can't change it. And it's a real pain in the neck because you have to go and add an entire new interface just to rename it or something like that. So I'd be interested in looking at that again and seeing if we can make that better as well. Yeah, the whole form just needs a rethink. The whole interface modal is just a mess. This is much better, but I think I do agree with the idea of a table.
Yeah, and I was just commenting in the RSC chat. So one reason why I particularly went with cards was because I'm trying to use the same vehicle that displays the information to input the information, so you get that better visual hierarchy. I think we can still do that with a table if it has like an inline edit to be able to add, right, using the same vehicle for display as for input. So I'll definitely play around with that.
Yeah, I mean it's add row, and then you've got 3 drop downs, right? IPv4 or 6, the subnet.
Right.
Well, not 3 drop downs, 2 drop downs on a field.
Right.
And then you're done, right? So I think it would save a lot of space. I think if you've only got 2, I mean 1 or 2 IP addresses, then this looks great. If you've got like 7, this is going to get really messy.
Sure.
So yeah, or at least not messy is the wrong word, but it's going to take up a lot of space to show what is actually a fairly small amount of information, right? Yes, just seeing what else comments are going on. So I guess what we should also talk about is getting involved in this, right, Marek?
Yeah. So what I wanted to also share today. You probably noticed that we send, or Roxanne sent, a lot of notes from these UX suggestions in the past. So you can find them on the Foreman dev list. You can search for subject dev/design or something like that. But we realized it would be nice if there are people who are generally interested in these UX improvements, so they can more participate into this. So we would like to continue these kind of demos because I think it was fun, at least for me. But also, if you're searching for some easy stuff, if you want to find some items to work on, like small patches, usually we identified stuff like, this color should be changed to green, or this icon should be removed, or something like that. We have a lot of items like this. So if you're watching and you're interested in this, we created a tracker in our Redmine. We'll send the link on the Foreman dev, where we'll keep these items. We normally track them in a Google document, but because if you want to start contributing the code, you always need to have a Redmine ticket, so we'll be converting it there. And we'll share this on the Foreman dev list, so make sure you're watching it there. And feel free to just stop by here on these demos. Feel free to discuss your ideas, and we'll try to provide help.
I know that there were a few pages, Marek, that we had talked about, hey, this actually probably needs a bigger redesign. Nothing, not enormous, but, it could use a lot more than just a button color change. I'm not against working with anybody, right? If we want to pursue any of those, just let me know.
Yep.
I'll also extend on what Marek said. It seems to me that this is community-facing stuff, and so I'm going to be. So you say you've probably seen it. People on the dev list will have seen it. People on the users list will not have seen all of the emails that have gone out about the sort of UX discussions that have been happening. So 2 comments. Firstly, if you're on the users list and not on the dev list, and this stuff excites you and you're interested in it, and you're interested in having a say on where the Foreman UI goes, join the dev list. It's a really good idea. It's really not that noisy. So come and be part of that conversation. But also specifically for these videos, I'm going to be sharing links and things to the users list so we can try and get the most kind of input. And so I'll put that tracker link on that email thread as well. Because, tomorrow's developers are today's users. So we should try and get a few more people interested. But yes, I do think if anyone's interested in this, check out the tracker. A lot of the issues are going to be trivial things that would be very, very easy for you to fix. So you can become a contributor really easy. Rox? Sorry, you're unmuted. I thought you wanted to say something.
Oh, no, I was just going to point out that, I really enjoy these types of interactive sessions where let's take a look at a draft and let's edit it and revise it and iterate on it until we get somewhere. So I'm up for all of that.
Yeah, it certainly seemed, we did the vertical navigation thing, which I'm still trying to get a demo of set up so we can get some feedback on, and that's going well. So that's the other thing I should mention is I'm slowly in the background preparing a demo box, which can be easily rolled out with varying proposals and patches and things for the community to play with, and it will have a decent number of hosts in it, and it can be reset on a regular basis, and people can just mess around with the UI, so we can try these things out. Right, once there's a PR to actually test, we can put that on the demo box and let people have a play with it, which will be super useful. That's not ready yet, but it's something I am working on. So the first plan is to get the vertical navigation stuff on there. That demo and that discussion went very well by all reports from the people I spoke to. I hope everyone's enjoyed this one as well. We will have more. There were a lot of emails to DevList about various UX things, so I'm sure we're going to have plenty more content to talk to you guys about. If you've enjoyed it, come let me know. If you didn't enjoy it, you don't want to see any more of these videos, come tell me that as well. You probably know where to find me by now. But for today, that has been the Foreman demo of the day, I guess. And thanks for watching. Do take care.